So we've talked about the assumptions that we bring to supervision for the spiritual director. We're also going to talk about the assumptions that we bring to supervision in relation to God and God's presence, both in spiritual direction and supervision. So the first and really core assumption that we bring is that God is present, that God is present in all of life experience, and that God wants to communicate God's self to us. So that's really our starting point for everything that we're doing in this spiritual direction training program, that God is a self-communicating God. God actually wants to communicate to us. So we're on the lookout for that communication. We're not questioning whether it happens or not. We're assuming that it does. It's just how we recognize it. And that God is present in all of life experience. So not just those things we would label Christian or label spiritual, but all of life experience. And therefore that means as a directee, they can bring whatever they want. As we say, if it's got energy for you, then it's likely that, if we scratch below the surface, God will be there. I always thought that Richard Rohr said this next little statement, but I discovered recently that it was actually someone else, that he was quoting someone else. But he said, well, I've heard him say, God comes to us disguised as our life. So God is in our life, perhaps disguised. Part of the process of spiritual direction is to pull back the disguise. And that's our work, that we are seeking to uncover where is God. And our assumption is that God is there. And that God wants to reveal God's self to us. So God is a self-communicating God. That's another core assumption that we bring to this practice of spiritual direction. And then that this communication of God causes some reaction or some response inside both ourselves as the director and the directee. So we notice something. One of my most favourite passages to do with all of this is the Emmaus Walk passage, and the disciples, after Jesus is gone and they recognise that it was Jesus, they say, did not our hearts burn within us on the road? And that's what we're talking about, this reaction, the heart burning within us. It's that noticing. And that's part of what we're on the lookout for. And again, why we need to be interiorly free, so we can notice that burning. We can recognise it, because often it's a whisper. And then, of course, another assumption is the awareness of God in spiritual direction and supervision sessions results in spiritual directors becoming more free. So the more we're aware that God's present with us, the more we become available and able to be with that presence of God, both for ourselves and to invite the directee to stay with it. The more comfortable we are, the more able we are to recognise it, then the more able we are to enable the directee to stay with it. So we assume that God is present, and we assume the more we're able to stay with these experiences of God, then the more we're able to enable our directee to. And then, of course, there's another assumption that's kind of the reverse. The more resistances we have in ourselves to God's presence or particular elements within the direction session, perhaps particular emotions or particular expressions, particular namings of God, anywhere where there is resistance in either ourselves as the director or in the directee, that will tend to close down our experience or our noticing of God's presence. So our awareness of God can be limited by both our resistance or the resistance within the directee. Now, resistance is quite a subject on its own, and there is going to be another one of these little online modules where we look at resistance in detail. But just to note at this point in our assumptions is that we assume if we are carrying resistances, or if the directee is carrying resistances, that's going to limit our capacity to recognise and be with God's presence.